Hello and welcome to the June 30th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Romeo and beside me is my colleague Anthony Bardaway.
Hello everyone. This is actually our first time recording in the same location together, seeing as how our power schedules seem to be pretty much opposite this week.
Yeah, unfortunately, with the power situation deteriorating, literally, DTEC, the regional power company, said yesterday on Telegram that 90% of their generation capacity has been either damaged or destroyed by Russian missiles and shelling. So things are not doing great with power. I managed to avoid the worst of it for a long time, but it hit me yesterday and might cause our recording and upload schedule to become a little erratic while we adjust to the new rhythm of things.
But with that said, this week is going to be a bit lighter. We have questions and answers. I put out the alert asking people to send us questions to Twitter, to Patreon, and on our Discord, which is attached to our Patreon. So go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype to get into contact with us that way, and where most of these questions come from. I kind of divided the questions up into a few broad categories to kind of chunk them together as well. So I have general war questions about politics, both Ukrainian and international, just general questions about Ukraine, a lot of questions about urbanism. A lot of people want to know about urban planning and public transport and stuff like that. That's great. We're orange-pilled over here. Some kind of catty gossip stuff and some assorted non-serious questions. So to start us off, on our war segment, which will be our probably most serious segment, our first question here: how did Ukrainians feel about NATO shooting down a shitload of Iranian drones while letting Ukrainians beg for basic artillery shells? Some details of the information here. This is referring to Iran shooting a lot of missiles and drones at Israel after an exchange between the two countries. This was not NATO shooting them down. A lot of them were shot down by Jordan and Iraq, but they're referring to basically how a lot of the air defense was supplied by the U.S. and how Israel is given a lot more leeway with its use of U.S.-supplied weapons than Ukraine is. So, Romeo, how do you think Ukrainians feel about this issue?
Honestly, from what I've seen, it's soured a lot of Ukrainians on Israel in general. Ukrainians, maybe not typically, but are kind of generally pro-Israeli, not because they're Zionist or they believe in the cause, but they simply see Israel as sort of an example to aspire to in terms of being a nation surrounded by enemies, which, as you can imagine, Ukrainians sympathize with. However, after Israel refused to help us for the longest time, that might be changing, who knows, and especially after Ukrainians saw how quickly the West responded to Israeli calls for aid and arms and assistance, really made people question the seeming double standard there, where, oh, look, Israel gets whatever it wants, basically even before asking, whereas we have to pretty much beg on our hands and knees for the smallest amount of equipment to keep us in the fight, which is not, as you can imagine, a great feeling.
Yeah, this will be another one where I will have some issue answering questions about Ukrainians in general, seeing as how most people I interact with, work with, that kind of thing, are journalists, soldiers, volunteers, that sort, who are a bit more keyed into political topics than the average citizen. But that said, yeah, in that group of people, I have noticed a certain level of bitterness that, especially considering with the Russian Kharkiv offensive that is now being beaten back, the restrictions that Ukrainians were put under on the use of foreign weaponry is a major factor in what that allowed that to happen. So seeing Israel not have such restrictions, and when they are given restrictions, they seem to be able to just kind of ransack over them without any repercussions. Yes, there is negative feelings about that. Not necessarily negative feelings towards, Israelis or anything like that, but the Western reaction to either one is very stark.
Yeah, it really kind of ground home the message that Ukraine is not really a priority for the West, unlike Israel is for whatever reason.
Okay, next one. What happens to the war when Putin dies? Is it like the Mongols stopping their invasion of Europe after the Han died?
So I'll take the lead on this one because I've been telling people for basically the longest time my idea of what will happen and why Putin's death, his personal death, is so important to ending the war. So the way, and this requires first understanding the way graft works in Russia. What Putin has built in the past 20 years, more than anything else, is a political structure meant to insulate him from coups, basically. For authoritarian leaders, their biggest enemies, their biggest risks are always domestic. It is international threats very rarely come up. As a result, any authoritarian leader worth his salt that wants to remain in power has to somehow ensure that he doesn't coup, that he doesn't get couped by some pissed off spies or military police or whoever it is with guns and some influence and can just roll up to the presidential palace and force him out at gunpoint. And the way Putin did this is that he built a system of graft that funnels the vast resource and mineral, the oil wealth from the state-owned companies through Putin's personal accounts. So a lot of this money is washed through accounts that we are fairly certain are controlled by Putin directly. Alexei Navalny, the Russian oppositionist who died in prison a while back, had numerous reports on this, tracing how these accounts are structured, the shell companies used. And what this allows Putin to do is it means that all of the big money that comes through needs his signature ultimately to be dispersed. Which means if he dies, all of the accounts that are currently under the personal oversight of Vladimir Putin, suddenly you have to figure out what to do with them. First, you have to figure out how to access those funds. These accounts aren't usually in Putin's names himself. They're registered to a distant cousin. They're registered to various random family members, though obviously Putin controls all of the money. Like his third cousin twice removed or whatever that controls the accounts that built his palace is not an influential person. But there are so many of these accounts, and they are rather obscure, again, because Putin doesn't want people digging into his secret stashes of money. But people are going to have to decide how that money is going to be dispersed in order to get paid. The Russian economy is pretty much focused on graft. The entire state apparatus of Russia is tuned to extract rent from the government. They consider like loss ratios for corruption as part of their budgetary planning because you kind of have to. It's an unavoidable fact of life. And it is the system that Putin built. He specifically built a system where not only is everyone corrupt, meaning that everyone is cynical, there's very little ideology beyond the most basest and populist messaging, and everyone relies on him for their daily dollar. If he dies, people are going to have to figure out how to get access to the money and then how to split it up. And knowing Russian culture and knowing the people in power in Russia, the way their structures are structured, in other words, the Siloviki class, like there's no way that kind of scenario passes without civil violence, whether that's, outright war in the streets or maybe just the high profile assassinations in the middle of Moscow like it was in the 90s and the early 2000s. That's hard to say. What I am fairly confident, though, is that there will be a mini civil war, at least between Chechnya and Ingushetia or Dagestan, since the only person that Kadyrov respects in the Russian government is Putin. That is, Kadyrov's Chechnya is loyal not to the Russian Federation, but to Putin himself. Without that, as strange as it sounds, moderating influence on Kadyrov, he has no reason to not pursue the territorial kind of dreams that his daddy had instilled in the family way back when. So there's so you're looking at least a gang war in Moscow while people figure out how the money works, and at the very least, a civil conflict in Chechnya and around Chechnya as both partisan independence movements and Kadyrov's own thugs and various regional militias start duking it out for influence. So that's the kind of least violent scenario of how things develop past Putin's death. My guess is things will be quite a bit more violent than that.
Yeah, the whole question of the Putin succession question, it's a whole lot of speculation, but as we've gone over before on this podcast, the Russian state is so hyper-centralized that if he just disappears one day, basically the keystone holding it all together is gone. They are trying recently, when we were talking about some of the recent promotions in the Russian ministries and such, I mentioned that several of the positions were very clearly done in order to kind of develop the careers of Putin loyalists. Basically, what happened when Yeltsin died, Putin was appointed as a caretaker of the Yeltsin family to make sure that they are fine afterwards and no revenge is taken against them. Whoever is being groomed right now for some kind of succession, and again, I am kind of seeing that happen in some places, though not enough, obviously, is that they are trying to make sure whoever comes next is a Putin loyalist. However, when you have something that centralized and that brittle, no amount of picking someone who will take over afterwards is going to be enough to actually prevent conflict. When everyone who can be picked as a successor only has power because Putin says so, when there is no more Putin, then what does it matter what he says so? Without their own power base building, which is very, very hard to do because Putin doesn't like it when people build power bases underneath him, there's no foundation there.
There's kind of no way for this gangster state to simply say, the Tsar is dead, let's elect another random nobody. No, you have to figure out how the money's going to be split up. Like, that's going to be the most important job for whoever is trying to succeed Putin. And the person who will ultimately take the chair in the presidential palace is going to be whoever figures out how to do the money the best.
Well, this is all answering the question of like what happens to state capacity to carry on the war. But think back to World War I. The February Revolution happened. The Tsar was overthrown and put into house arrest. And for another year, the war was still ongoing. Russia was still engaged in World War I after they overthrew the government of Russia. So just because the hyper-centralized autocrat is gone does not necessarily mean the war is over. In this case, I think that once he's gone, there will be some kind of decentralization of power in Russia, and there will still be various ideological factions who very much want to keep the war coming. This is like very core to the issue of Russian nationalism now, and I don't see that disappearing from people's minds. Like, let's look at some extreme example of this, of Russia breaking down into a civil war to see who the successor is. Well, let's say that there will be a faction that controls Rostov. Rostov is the one who welcomed the Wagner revolt. There's a lot of, nationalist sentiment there. Would there be some kind of Don Cossack Republic kind of LARPer faction in the Russian Civil War? They would keep the war going, I think. They would still be hostile to Ukrainians, and even though they would not be anywhere near as strong as the Russian state, that's still a problem of, border skirmishes, raids, hostage-taking, terrorism. Keep in mind that the Russo-Ukraine war is kind of unusual in how conventional it is. Interesting sentence to say. If the war goes, there will still be these Russian ultranationalists that will be attacking Ukraine in one way or another that would probably look more in line with conflicts elsewhere in the world that are more based on terror attacks and irregular warfare.
I mean, there's a fairly good chance that the occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast might just consolidate under some warlord, whoever, that the soldierly kind of the conscripts trapped in Ukraine, quote unquote, if Putin goes, and if the Ministry of Defense is in chaos and no one knows who's in charge of the generals, all the generals don't know who's in charge of them. They're all trying to figure it out. you might just see the development of large-scale criminal gangs like you have in Latin America, because you just have a bunch of soldiers with nowhere to go, no one paying them, and a bunch of land kind of ripe for the taking, quote unquote. Though the hope is, of course, that in a scenario like this, the Ukrainian military would be robust enough to sweep those remnants back into Russia when necessary. Though, again, it's really hard to say how the death of Putin would affect Ukraine's war aims as well, and what opportunities that Ukraine might take advantage of in the kind of early days of his passing.
Our next question here is kind of tied into the first one. Even in the best case scenario where Ukraine wins the war, gets all stolen territory returned, massive reparations, EU membership, and a clear and timely path to join NATO, will it remain a highly militarized society with extremely strict security measures for generations to come? Zelensky has spoken positively about the militarized nature of Israeli society in the past, but I question how widely shared his opinion is. In this case, I think it's necessary. Russia, whatever form Russia takes, if Putin's still alive, if Putin's dead, if there is replaced by some other group, Russia requires a extreme amount of basically denazification in order to kind of strip it of its imperial ambition. And I don't see that happening. There would have to be like a literal occupation of the entirety of the Russian Federation, where there are people combing through textbooks and, driving out former officials. And that's just not going to happen. So what we have is going to be a Russia that is maybe not now, maybe not 5 years from now, maybe not 20 years from now, but someday would do it again. And Ukraine has to be ready for that potentiality. So there's always going to be the need for military readiness. I mean, look at South Korea. I don't think Israel's the best example for that because the threats to Israel are asymmetric in nature. But I think South Korea is a better look at that, where there is this line and we have to make sure that nothing crosses that line. And because of that, South Korea has a massive military industrial complex. It has mandatory military service. That's just what's going to have to be. How widely shared this opinion is, I don't think it's so controversial to say, personally.
I don't know. I actually think it's rather unpopular, and people are not really willing to be like keep quite as high level of military residence as perhaps someone might hope. The fact is, like, Ukrainians are tired of the war. Morale has definitely been ground. There's far more cynicism to hear from people's conversations that there were even a year ago, much less 2 years ago. So I really doubt, and on top of that, with the efforts that we see the Zelensky administration going to maintain a sense of normality in the cities in the rear, especially in the capital, in Lviv, I feel like the government is not going to push for this heavy militarization, and I don't think that people especially want it. The attitude is very much just, we want them to leave us alone. While there are people that realize that, like Anthony just noted, Russia is unlikely to be denazified to the level that they will abandon their imperial ambitions. Their whole state mythology is built on these ambitions. It is fundamental to the very conception of Russia as a nation. So again, yes, in 5, 10, 20 years after the end of the war, some demagogue is going to realize, oh, here's, a historical grievance that I can use to prod the people into doing my will again. And they're going to start trying to start shit. But I don't believe that society will be so militarized as even South Korea's. The draft is highly criticized. More and more people are being exposed to the conscription system, which is just outright hated and despised and held in contempt by pretty much everyone. It's impossible to get away from stories of scandal, of these draft officers acting in ways that are just frankly thuggish. And even when these stories aren't true, and a lot of them are, psychological operations, basically just psyops spread by anonymous Telegram channels, people do believe that, and they're not in any hurry or rush to rebuild society along these militarized lines, because they don't particularly like the way the military is being run, and especially the way civilians interact with it, which is primarily via the draft office.
Well, then that gets into the question of where that Israel comparison might come more into play, in that, so there's this one book that came out I don't know, like 15 years ago, I don't remember when, called The Startup Nation, where it tried to ask the question of where Israel's tech sector comes from. And part of that answer was that through the military, a lot of training takes place and a lot of social connections take place are then translated into the private sphere. And I do heavily criticize that book. However, the argument that could be applied is that in a post-war scenario is what we're looking at. There is a way to structure some kind of military service in a way that is beneficial to civilian society. Now, of course, the militarization of Israeli society is a problem that we're not going to get into. But in this case, there is a way to have military recruitment, even mandatory military service, that is not as like arm twisting as some of these draft officers are. Although I do have a funny draft officer story, not that funny, but more pathetic than everything. I was going across the pedestrian bridge the other day, the one in the center of the city off of Krishatik, and there were the draft officers standing around. Most of them weren't doing anything, but they did stop this one group of people who were like 18, 19 years old. But they did not talk to the men in the group. They stopped the group to chat up the girls. Like, they use their authority as people who have the ability to stop people and use it to flirt with these girls who did not have the ability to walk away, because technically their boyfriends were or friends or whatever they were being stopped for this inspection. I thought that was gross.
Like I said, the government has put a lot of work into reforming the draft system. It has not worked. They did an inspection, canceled it after a week. They fired all the heads of every draft office in the country, replaced them with active serving military. Did not seem to help. There are more and more stories and more people expressing, men especially, expressing that they'd rather hide than join the military. No one wants to do infantry. Everyone wants to be a drone pilot, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be a up-road battle to convince people that the draft offices have been really reformed. And as we can see, they so far haven't been. We're in the middle of a war. It's a little difficult to do. But even after the war, it's going to be hard to convince people that suddenly the draft offices are not corrupt and totally working, to benefit you and the nation, and not just to get the head of the draft office another villa in Spain.
Okay, next one. How many Patriot missile systems are deployed in Ukraine today? There have been announcements about different countries giving them to Ukraine, but it's not clear among all the different sources and commentators. So to the extent that you can, I'd like to get details on how many complete systems there are, where they're deployed, and which countries supplied them. And Romeo, you were just researching this to answer the question, so I'll leave that to you.
So from what we know, from what we can gather from public sources, and again, we don't have access to any classified information, and if we did, we would not share it on a public forum. But from what we know from data that is open, there are approximately 4 Patriot systems in Ukraine donated so far by the United States, which has given us at least 2, and Germany, which has also given us at least 2. There have been commitments by Romania. There have been, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, the U.S. and Israel are reportedly in talks to present Ukraine with a number of Patriot batteries that Israel is decommissioning in favor of some newer kit, and that number has ranged from 8 to 11, though again, we'll see how that shakes out. The Israelis have not been very forthcoming with aid so far. And on top of that, I believe a few other European nations, the Netherlands, Belgium, I believe, have also at least pledged their systems to us. A lot of these commitments came a long time ago, so I would be surprised if those systems weren't in country, but just not publicly announced. Obviously, you don't want to tell Russia the exact amount of air defense, like effective Western air defense batteries you have. It's better to keep them guessing and keep them thinking anything could be a Patriot, especially after the Ukrainians started using Patriots to conduct strikes into Russia itself. So there's at least 4 again from the US and Germany, and there are a bunch more commitments planned. The difficult thing for these commitments is they'll change. People will say, countries will claim that they're going to donate 4 Patriots, and then after a while it becomes only 1 or only spare parts, or suddenly there's some domestic issue and the parliamentary opposition in that country saying, no, we need the Patriots for our own defense. We can't give them away, and it all gets bogged down in red tape and delays and ultimately doesn't come. So it's hard to say exactly how many definite commitments we have, but we definitely have at least 4 active Patriot batteries in service in Ukraine right now.
This next one is pretty connected as far as equipment goes. When the much vaunted F-16s arrive in Ukraine, July, how many will there be? And when they begin operations, what kind of operations will they be used for? Will it be to shoot down Russian planes, drones, and missiles? Or will it be used in ground attack or ground support operations? And the best answer to this is they aren't going to be telling anyone. I have a feeling that it'll be a bit more as far as ground attack purposes. However, there's no great answer to this. When they're arriving, how many there will be. There have been rumors that some have already arrived in Ukraine, but that's just rumor. That's not confirmation. That's not news. So anything involving F-16s, especially considering how the schedules for them have been pushed back again and again and again, and there's really no great answer to this. I'm sorry for that one.
One thing we could probably guess, what's the analyst speak for it? Likely, I guess, is that they'll try to use the F-16s out of range of Russian air defense due to any real damage that the F-16s take that are going to require anything more than kind of field fixes or low-scale maintenance is going to have to be done out of country. As a result, command is probably going to try and ensure that the F-16s operate in unopposed airspace as much as possible, just to minimize the downtime if they do get damaged. Because if they do, and it's something serious, that plane has to be disassembled, shipped back to Europe, back to Germany, or Poland, wherever they're going to set up the repair and maintenance bays, fixed there, and then shipped back. And if those bases don't have the required material on hand, and they have to order some from the US, and you have to wait for that shipping. So my guess is they're going to try and minimize the kind of maintenance and damage control times that these planes might face by trying to keep them away from anything that could damage them in a serious fashion. Not to mention that would be a pretty big blow to morale. So that's my guess, is they're going to try to use them sparingly and as unopposed as possible.
And there's also just the PR factor. Every time Russia destroys a piece of Western military equipment, it becomes like a big celebration on their part, and no one wants to see that. And the last of our war questions is, finally, has the much-delayed arrival of U.S. and other Western ammunition and weapon systems changed the mood of Ukrainians? Is there more optimism now than, say, in January? Less war weariness? Well, the main factor in optimism and war weariness is related to power outages, and that's a problem now that was not in January. So that's just the baseline. However, I would say that the lack of this huge ammunition starvation that Ukraine was facing in the early part of this year, that being over, has definitely made the war outlook a lot better. It's not as horrible as it was at that time. So that has translated into more optimism. Though, again, that's just me speaking from the perspective of people involved directly in the military and not having as much of an ear on normal people think.
So Ukrainians are aware of a lot of these obstacles, but again, the power outages are hard to deal with. The knowledge that there is no quick solution to these power outages is another thing that really weighs people down. The fact that when we had the mass attacks last winter, you could presume that if we got air defense, we could save more of our energy infrastructure. Unfortunately, we simply did not get enough air defense to properly protect our energy infrastructure. And as I said, like I said at the beginning of the episode, tons of it has been destroyed. I mean, it's hard to overstate just the scale of destruction of the energy infrastructure that Russia has inflicted. And people know this. People know that you can't build new power plants overnight, that if you try to build a new power plant, it'll get bombed. So I can't say that people feel especially optimistic. There is no sense of impending doom like there was when we didn't have any munitions and the Russian lines were inching forward. We can now stabilize at least, but I don't think that the mood is going to change from grim fatalism anytime soon. People need a win. They need to see that there are wins to be had and that there are territorial gains to be made. I think until we see at least some sort of major gain for the Ukrainian side, people's moods are going to remain stubbornly fatalistic.
Okay, now for the politics section. Have you noticed any quirks unique to Ukrainian electoral politics? This question comes from me just having learned about, quote, voter shaming, a thing that doesn't exist where I'm from, or not in the sense as it does in the US, UK. Okay, so I think we had an election episode where we kind of described the Ukrainian political system, so I'll just kind of take from our main thesis there, which is that the main thing about Ukrainian electoral politics is that political parties don't really exist. There are powerful people who create parties underneath them. And even if that party goes away, they can make a new one, as long as that actual power exists.
It's better to think of this in terms of power blocks rather than Westminster type political parties.
So, for example, we have the quote-unquote pro-Russia vote that people would talk about. Well, the Party of Regions was banned, and so they reformatted under the opposition bloc. The opposition bloc had a slightly different leadership in that obviously Yanukovych was no longer there, so some of the lieutenants and such took over. That existed until this war, with Medvedchuk being tossed out and the party banned, and then it just reformatted into another thing with the loyalists kind of staying where they are. The party disappeared twice, but it still basically exists with mostly the same leadership. So the party itself doesn't matter to them.
Yeah, honestly, you could even see this in what happened to the Communist Party after it was banned. They all just joined the Party of Regions, and then look, and like there's no communism to be found. They just found whatever reactionary oligarch asshole needs them or has the most money to pay them, and then joined that.
Yeah, or Zelensky, there was no party that Zelensky formed under. He kind of created it within the span of like 3 months, and it became the biggest political party in the country. And most of it was not connected to any kind of previous party structures, except for some pretty minor ones in comparison. It's all shifting. It's all about, it can become new whenever, every voting cycle, basically. And that is unusual coming from America, where literally the last time we had different parties was when the Whig Party existed in the early 19th century. So small difference there.
One of the, I think, quirks that is a contributing factor to this sort of, I don't know what you call it, non-party politics, non-ideological party politics is the fact that Ukraine has a number of majoritarian districts. These are districts where people are elected not according to party list, but simply by whoever gathers the most votes. Historically, they've been the seat of some of the most corrupt people in parliament, and it's allowed them to hold on to their power since they can just buy the votes for their little district over and over and over again. And there are fewer of them now. Ukraine has been slowly reforming these majoritarian districts out, but previously they formed a not insignificant power block of basically free agents or mercenaries, and they would join whoever bribed them the most, pretty much. So this kind of fluid mercenary structure really let or really dilutes the power of a political party, because even if a party is having problems with maintaining discipline amongst its own MPs, it can just get one of these mercenaries from the majoritarian districts to join on whatever proposal or bill they're trying to push through instead, which overall makes the point of a party less important.
Yeah, I guess the final quirk I'll say is that there's also a pretty big divide between national and local politics in Ukraine that doesn't exist elsewhere. In local elections and regional elections, there will still be, the major parties, and Zelensky's party still got a significant share in the local elections as well. However, a lot of it does come down to local party structures that aren't necessarily attached to national party structures. One of the most successful, quote unquote, political parties in local elections was just very loose alliance of mayors that existed in different cities. These mayors had nothing to do with each other than the fact that they were quote unquote independents, and they wanted a party to run under that was basically pro local power because it was run by the people with local power. Next question. What do you think about the state of press freedom in the country? Is it really getting worse? Yes and no. So on one hand, in the form of yes, I'd say that, or in one form, in the sense of it not getting worse and getting better in some ways, is that there's less loyalty to what was it called, the marathon or something, the television marathon.
Yeah,
the national marathon. It was like all the news channels kind of merged into one, and since then, more and more of them have kind of been breaking away from the marathon. Like, we're not doing that. And this marathon was, I think, it was necessary in the early days of the war, where you needed one place to go for where the Russian army is. That's pretty important information. But it did kind of choke off some independent voice. And with more people kind of going back to their kind of home base, as opposed to being part of this singular news outlet, it has allowed for more diversity in that way. However, we still get some interference from the executive branch. There's one issue of, who was it? Bihus, a pretty respected investigative journalist in Ukraine. I want to say we covered this when it happened, but it's not in my memory that we did. I'm not too sure. But basically, they were doing an investigation into corruption, and so a bunch of them were arrested and accused of doing drugs at a party. So that was obvious way of attacking the press by members of the executive branch. We don't know exactly how far up that may go. But then on the other hand, it was reacted to pretty strongly. People did not take that line down. The press really fought back against it. So there is that push-pull, even when there is restrictions on freedom of the press. It's a delicate game that I think that the press has quite a bit of strength in when they choose to flex it. But I'd say the biggest hurdle to freedom of the press is not even suppression or anything like that. It's just funding. Press outlets in Ukraine, especially independent ones, don't have a lot of money. And when you don't have a lot of money, that restricts your ability to do stuff. Most outlets in Ukraine have suffered a gradual attrition of readership, international readership anyway, over the course of the war, which means loss of ad revenue, means loss of subscription revenue, and you need a well-funded press to have a press. Patreon.com/Ukraine without hype, by the way. So I think that is the hurdle that is harder to deal with than the exact question of freedom of the press. Although I would say that in the case of war journalism, there have always been complaints that the military is very stingy with its access to the front lines. I understand why. In the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there were not many direct restrictions. A lot of journalists went right up to the front. A lot of them got cut up in the Russian advance and were killed, including one of your colleagues, Romeo. So that is something that they've always been afraid of. So it's not necessarily only a question of restricting information. A lot of this is done out of an overabundance of caution. But because of that overabundance of caution, it means that there are less journalists giving the news from where the news needs to come from.
So from my perspective as an editor, a news editor, newspaper editor, however you want to call it, I really wouldn't say that there have been any overt restrictions on the press. The government is as unwilling to talk to journalists as it ever was under the Zelensky administration. His administration has never been very keen on answering questions from journalists in a prompt and timely manner, and that has not really changed. At the same time, there's nothing stopping people from hosting opposition interviews and having opposition figures appear and provide their opinions on current events and so on. At NV on the radio, we have people like that pretty much constantly, to the extent that the Zelensky administration probably doesn't really like our news agency too much. But it's open, it's functioning. We don't get letters from the SBU or whoever threatening us to stop our reporting. So nothing that overt has really happened. To be honest, I personally have not seen any great change in press freedom, except for, yes, the military still doesn't really allow people who are not highly vetted to embed. At the same time, journalists are still embedding with units on the front line. They're still posting stories, both from minor publications or even just freelancers, all the way to the big institutions, the big papers. So honestly, status quo. I don't think a lot's changed.
Next one, what do Ukrainians think about leftist political movements? I'd imagine there's some animosity regarding the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union, but there was also a major anarchist movement in Ukraine circa World War I, the Russian Revolution with Nestor Makhno. Does that still persist? Are there still strong trade unions, leftist political movements? Does the population hate and resent socialism because of the many decades of Russian atrocities? Is there nostalgia for the way things once were? Is any of this changing in any direction for any demographic group?
Well, Ukrainians don't really like the USSR. They're not real big fans of socialism. It's one of the reasons that everyone who was elected turns out to is a neoliberal technocrat, because that's the kind of accepted socioeconomic ideology here. There's no real left. There's no real ideology in Ukraine. Even the highly vaunted far right, there was never, they never had anything close to the influence anyone claimed. Again, like we said earlier in the question regarding the quirks of the Ukrainian political system, ideology itself is seen as suspect. Believing in an ideology is seen as suspect, regardless of what that ideology is, beyond the very broad strokes of pro-democracy and anti-corruption. If you hold beliefs stronger than that, people get kind of leery. There are trade unions. There are leftist political movements. The unions are currently kind of involved in the war effort to lead a labor movement. And even outside of that, the unions are like unions in much of the world, not very powerful, clinging on to, the dregs of past victories, I guess, or their past status as having some kind of influence. And then they do. There are a number of trade unions that are still quite influential. They have been able to stymie, or they had in previous years prior to the full-scale invasion been able to stymie some very anti-labor bills that the then economy minister was trying to pass. So they do exist, though on a societal level, people don't really talk about the unions in any way other than a joke. You really have to be kind of plugged into what's left of the labor movement in Ukraine to even be aware of that. And again, people do just generally have an aversion to anything regarding the USSR, though that is itself a reaction to the full-scale war. Prior to the full-scale war, one of the more popular dollar store analogs that was opening up was literally called Prices Like in the USSR. Again, it was a cheap dollar store. They all rebranded after the full-scale invasion. But of course, the old generations are always nostalgic for the times of their youth. Time buries a lot of sins and gives everyone rose-colored glasses. But overall, there's very little appetite among the Ukrainian people for any kind of large-scale political project that isn't joining the EU and NATO.
Yeah, and look at any country. If you look at people who are elderly, 70s, 80s, what do they look back on? They look back on the time when they were 20 years old and were hanging out with their friends and meeting a bunch of girls and having a lot of fun, and their body still worked the way that they wanted it to work and all that. And in many countries, that becomes coded towards some kind of conservatism. In Ukraine, that is coded towards Soviet nostalgia. Though, like you said, the war has diminished that. And that's still conservatism, to be clear. And with that in mind, in that same track there, a lot of the political forces in Ukraine that call themselves communist or socialist weren't really. They were socially conservative, tied to religion, all the things that you would expect a conservative political party to be. So, and most importantly, they're pro-Russia. So the idea of pro-socialism and pro-Russia is all very tied together. Part of that question, though, regarding Nestor Makhno is that, okay, so there is an anarchist movement in Ukraine. There are anarchist soldiers. We know a lot of these people, but as a larger thing, Nestor Makhno is an aesthetic. He's a dude who was cool. He had his machine guns on carriages at a time where that was like a major military innovation. He has a very kind of striking image to him. So there's a lot of people in Ukraine who idolize the image of Nestor Makhno, especially in the military. There's a lot of soldiers who think Makhno was a really cool guy that are not anarchist or socialist or leftist in any sense of the word. So he's kind of joined the Ukrainian de-ideologicalized pantheon of figures. So he even exists in like a similar kind of cultural space as like a Bandera. Like the ideology behind him does not matter, but he was a fighter, he fought Russians, and he looks cool on a banner, and that's about it. This next one... I remember when Reznikov got replaced by Umerov, there is speculation about the symbolism of appointing a Crimean Tatar as Minister of Defense. Was there anything to it? Almost 1 year later, did anything come of it? There's not much to this. The cause of the Crimean Tatars is already pretty deeply embedded into the Ukrainian national cause. So yeah, there's really not much to build off of. There's a lot of support for Crimean language and schooling. It's just there's only so much that can be done in the absence of actually liberating Crimea. It's always going to be a hope for the future more than anything else. Is there a lot of dread in Ukraine about the U.S. election? Do Ukrainians see Trump as an existential threat?
There's a lot of dread, but at the same time, Ukrainians, I won't say that they like Trump, but they understand him because he is quintessentially a Ukrainian politician. He's a loud, rich demagogue without any sense of taste who just says crazy populist stuff all the time that no one really believes is said for any other reason than entertainment. That's kind of how Ukrainians see him. They're, for reasons that I will be honest, still confound me. A weird belief that somehow Trump could be persuaded to the Ukrainian side. That has luckily been dying in recent months as Trump continues to talk and Ukrainians continue to realize that he is very happy to give us all back to Moscow. He doesn't give a shit. So there's... but at the same time, they don't, I think most Ukrainians don't really understand the nuances of U.S. politics, and they are not really cognizant of just quite how big of a risk to democracy that Trump poses, and by extension to military aid for Ukraine from the U.S.
Yeah, I'd say that they should be more worried about Trump than they currently are is my take on that. They don't really see him as big of a threat as he actually is. And keep in mind that when American aid for Ukraine was released, it was done with kind of a bit of conservative reasoning behind that. Go to our episode, and I was talking about how some Republicans were swayed to the Ukrainian side by talking about the suppression of Protestants in the occupied territories. So because of that kind of breathed new life into the idea that the Republicans are not as much of a problem as they are. This one, you get one chance to slap the shit out of a world leader aligned with Ukraine. Who is it? My answer, Aliyev of Azerbaijan. President Aliyev of Azerbaijan is a dictator who is his base of support relies on a state of continuous war against the Armenians. Therefore, I don't see his aggression ending anytime soon. He is technically helping Ukraine, but is also doing a lot of, say, sanction alleviation for Russia, we can call it. But Ukrainian politicos do have a strong connection to Azerbaijan because of the support that Azerbaijan has given throughout the years, as well as Armenia, especially in the past, though much less so now, being more hostile to the Ukrainian cause. So yeah, Aliyev.
For me, it's Boris Johnson. I know he's not PM. And honestly, I don't care. I just want to really slap Boris Johnson. I hate him. I hate him with the burning, indestructible passion of 1,000 suns going supernova. He is, quite frankly, one of the signs of the decline of Western civilization. And I just really want to slap the living fucking shit out of Boris Johnson.
Yeah, agreed on that point as well. Moving on to general Ukraine questions. And this one is pretty meaty. I don't know how far we can get into it. I'm curious about how the Ukrainian people think about each other, how the war has affected them differently. There's people under occupation in Donbass. There's people who are free but in the teeth of Russian bombardment in Kharkiv or Kherson. People who are relatively far away and mostly okay, but still in some danger, such as Kyiv and Lviv. And then the refugee diaspora who is technically out of the conflict, obviously not having a great time. Do the people in more danger resent those in relative safety? How do those still in the country feel about those who've left? Are the farmers who've lost their land to Russian advance resentful of the folks in Kyiv whose lives are relatively unperturbed? What do you got?
Honestly, I haven't really seen a lot of it. I'm sure some resentment exists just because people are humans. But I don't know. I've not seen a lot of it. There's still a sense that we're all kind of in here together. On top of that, people don't want to shit on places they might have to move to. If you're in Dnipro and the center of your city is getting shelled, you don't exactly want to shit on Kyiv because that might be where you will have to move to very shortly. So I don't know what to say. I haven't really seen a lot of this. I have heard from soldiers that it is very disconcerting and sometimes even to them offensive how quote unquote normal life is in Kyiv, and especially just considering what they've gone through. But I haven't heard similar things from civilians from frontline zones. So at least according to my experience, I don't think it's a thing.
Yeah, in my experience, it's not something people vocalize much if it does exist. I saw a trailer for a movie that's coming out. It's on the fair circuit right now about a team of cheerleaders for older women, I think 50 plus. And before the war, they were all together. Then with the war, half of them became refugees and half stayed in place. And apparently the purpose of this documentary is to explore the feelings of the people who left and how they may feel like they might have abandoned the country, or if there's or the way they said is the people who stayed and the people who left, and if there is going to be this huge fracture between them. So that kind of gets into this next question we'll have about art and stuff, but it's something I feel it feels kind of gross to talk about, to say that, oh, those people don't have it bad enough as people are here. So I'm sure people feel it. Soldiers, like you said, will mention it, but it hasn't become a major societal issue. It may in the future, but I don't think so yet. So this next question, how is the art world in Ukraine responding to the past decade of conflict? Now we've talked about the ongoing Russian attempts at cultural genocide. I imagine the art world has something to say about that. Are there any new styles or movements? How much of it is about the conflict versus other things? Are there certain mediums that become more prominent? Has there been a flourishing and decline? Are things about the same? Is it mostly for domestic consideration? Are there big attempts at international outreach? Any recommendations for folks I should check out? This is something that I would like to explore more in the future. I don't have a well-formulated answer for you now. I would say that since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, so in the very beginning, there are a lot of people, artists, writers, who are not creating anything. But as time has gone on, that has changed. More people have gotten into it. There's one very prominent writer, for example, Stanislav Azayev, who is on the front line right now. He enlisted, he became a soldier like many have, and he just posted the other day that he wrote a full paragraph of his next book on his phone while he was in a trench. So art is still being made. And a lot of it does have to do with the war, of course. There's been a lot of art exhibitions recently, and everyone that I've been to has in some way revolved around the war, about refugees, about children, how they've been affected. You can't escape the war in the arts. I would like to explore this question a bit more at a later time, though. I'm just going to skip over going too deep into it now because it's quite a deep one that I'm not really a specialist in. We got a few questions about the cities. We're going to try and condense some of these. Are there any urban planning responses to the conflict? Are cities setting up building codes to make buildings more resistant? Have the public transit systems changed their operation? Are there proposals for reconstruction that seek to transform the more damaged cities in a positive way rather than rebuilding them exactly as they were? Unfortunately, no, those plans are not in place. As of right now, the most destroyed cities are kind of largely being written off, because in order to do any reconstruction in these places, you're looking at a multi-year process of demining. Like, if we retake Avdiivka tomorrow and try to rebuild Avdiivka, would you even send in a construction crew before months and months and months of making sure that it's safe to go there? No. Many of these heavily destroyed cities are, I'm afraid, probably going to be destroyed forever, never to be reconstructed. Are there any other answers to it, though? I mean, there are more strict guidelines for shelters.
Like, that's really been the main thing, is from at least the civil society side, is like ensuring that shelters are up to code and that schools have properly equipped shelters. And honestly, not much else. It's mostly just that. There is a very widespread feeling amongst the public that any money that we have should be used to defeating the Russians, and everything else can wait. And actually, there's been a lot of dissatisfaction with the administration of Vitali Klitschko. He's the mayor of Kiev, because he continues to do road repair and beautification projects even during wartime. And I've heard many, many people grumble about this. You'll find articles of accusing them of everything short of treason for doing this. So people are not very happy. They want the Russians beaten pretty much more than anything else, and everything else can wait until after the war. Because to be honest, there's no point in building anything if a Russian missile can just blow it up again.
We'll combine these next two questions. We've got a question about car culture as well as public transit. How has public transit been operating, especially through COVID, into full-scale invasion? Is there talk of expansion of service in general, but in particular paratransit? I would say that public transit in Ukraine in general is quite good. You can get to anywhere in the country through a combination of trains, buses, commuter trains. I've done it. I've gotten to some pretty middle of nowhere places using only public transportation, and the schedules are usually pretty good. Talking about Kiev itself, there is a very severe lack of, you can still do it, but there's just not enough. This has been something that, the Klitschko administration, people have been bugging them to do, and them just neglecting it. We do need more bus lines and everything. There's not enough. Kiev is kind of overbuilt in some areas that make transit more difficult. So the city is split in half, the east side of the river and the west side of the river. And one of the most looked forward to projects in the city is a metro line that runs north to south on the east side of the city, which is the side of the city that's where a lot of people live. It's much more residential, very built up apartment blocks and stuff. So a lot of people live on the east side and work on the west side. This metro tunnel has been talked about for decades at this point, and nothing has ever come of it. So there are these problems. There are some unfortunate choke points in the city. Might want to make a video about this exactly, but the car versus public transit thing is an important issue with Kiev, and though you can survive in Kiev quite easily without a car, there are a lot of policy failures by the Klitschko administration. But paratransit, referring to people with disabilities, the big change here happened during Eurovision. With Eurovision, they needed more accessibility around where the stadium would be, the site of filming Eurovision. So a lot of that area around that, they built up more ramps and such. But for most of the city, you're going to run into problems. I bike around a lot, and even then I have to kind of pick up the bike and carry it upstairs at points, which is not easy to do if you're going to be in a wheelchair. So that's something that's definitely lacking. Okay, getting into the less and less serious topics here, though. Getting into talking about other people segment, I'm calling it. Why is there so much pro-Russian sentiment in the podcasting community? It's because so many podcast bros are trying to be Joe Rogan knockoffs.
Because they're all friends with each other and they only have one joke.
Yeah, that's kind of what it is. A lot of the podcasters live in within walking distance of each other, either in Brooklyn or Los Angeles. So probably not walking distance in Los Angeles. There's a lot of closed loops of information there, a lot of people working off the same jokes and the same meme and same ideas that are not very well educated. So a lot of the comedians and stuff especially are not well-educated people, but they want to sound edgy. And the thing is, Ukraine is a cause that is popular with your mom who liked Obama, and their mother who likes Obama is who these people hate. They hate their mothers who like Obama and therefore have to be as edgy teen as they can be, even though they are 40 years old.
And on top of that, the algorithm likes controversy. The more lurid and loud you can make a claim or an accusation or a take, the higher likeliness it is that it's going to go viral, that it will be popular. So instead of doing research on a topic, it's very easy to rack up those points by just referring to the memes of Ukraine Nazis and corruption and fucking Biden's laptop and dick and whatever the hell these people talk about. Full confession, I don't listen to podcasts. I barely even listen to our own podcast. But from what I have listened, that's generally just how they do it. It's a joke topic for them. It's something they can use to easily get a few knowing winks out of their audience, refer to a popular meme, and get a bunch of pro-Ukrainian people mad at them so they can farm that for engagement when the episode goes up. That's the long and short of it. They're assholes who respond to market incentives, and the market incentives are just fucking shit.
So yeah, the question of, is it because so many podcast bros are trying to be Joe Rogan knockoffs? Yes, that's really the long and short of it. Yes, they're trying to be Joe Rogan or a more edgy version of Joe Rogan, or the Chapo guys, I think, is the other thing to follow, and they are just as unpleasant most of the time. That said, do you have any other podcasts to recommend? There have been a lot of podcasts that have shown up recently. I haven't listened to too many of the super recent ones. The Telegraph does a lot of good interviews. Exploring Ukraine is a good one that has a lot of especially more intellectual topics. Listen to the Eastern Border with Kristaps Andersons, who I've gone into the field with on a few occasions. I've interviewed him. He's interviewed me. I don't know, like there is still not enough media as a whole out there, though. Like I said, I have seen some pop up that I just haven't listened to at all, because oftentimes I listen to podcasts, I want to have topics that I'm not engaged with at all times. I listen to a lot of video game and movie podcasts because the rest of my life is war and death and politics and horrible things. Out of the various types of pro-Russia shill, which do you find the most annoying?
Ooh, the most annoying. This is a tough one. I think for me, the most annoying are the types that have a mass media appeal. Who am I thinking of? Like the people who are kind of treated by some media outlets as quote unquote normal guests, and have their platform to say they're obviously paid for propagandist opinions, that everyone who is sitting across them in an interview is just pretending that these are their own thoughts and not literally something they took money to say. I think that's the most annoying, is people who are who are obvious Russian shills, but are somehow treated by the West as being kind of, maybe slightly partisan, but ultimately reasonable interlocutors. I just can't stand those pieces of shit. Just, take your stand and don't pretend to be fucking moderate. You're a fascist sympathizer.
Yeah, there's a large constellation of horrible pro-Russian shills that take many forms and faces to appeal to different types of people. And the ones who annoy me the most are the concern trolls. So what's a concern troll? A concern troll is someone who pretends to be presenting an argument that they care about these people so much, and that's why this bad thing has to happen, basically. So the people who say, oh, all these Ukrainians are being fed into the war machine because Joe Biden and Newland and are forcing them to fight to the last Ukrainian. I care about Ukraine. That's why I think they should surrender. That's the worst to me. Because you have your outright Nazis who just revel in being Nazis and terrible and will say outright that they want Russia to destroy us. You have, the tankies who will just say outright that Ukraine is the outpost of the Zionists, and once Ukraine is destroyed, then it'll be a blow against Zionist occupation or whatever. They just go out there and say their belief. I can deal with that. The concerned trolls, though, who act like it's just they just feel it in the depths of their soul that the Ukrainian people really want to do what they want them to do, when really it's just there to cause damage and kill and destroy. That's the worst type to me. So we'll be finishing off with our less serious questions. So what are some of your most petty and unimportant grievances about life in Ukraine? The small stuff that objectively does not matter, but sticks in your craw. Okay, here's my pettiest of complaints. So the bike lane right next to my apartment that goes through a park. In this park, there is a gate that allows garbage trucks to access the dumpsters and such that are in the park. This gate is frequently left open, and left open in such a way that it blocks the bike path. Under most circumstances, this is not that big of a deal because you can just go around it. However, during the power blackouts, when there are no streetlights, you don't see that this gate is open. So it has become a danger to myself and others, and that's my pettiest complaint.
My pettiest complaint is probably the fact that because there is, let's say, lax enforcement of laws in general in Ukraine, a lot of people in private neighborhoods will block off one side of their street to prevent traffic from going through it. Despite the fact that, of course, they have no right to do this. They'll either install bollards, they'll put in a Schluckbaum, what do you call them in English? They'll put in a gate. They'll just put in concrete blocks. And as a result, when you're driving and you see something on a map, you see a road in a map, and you're like, oh, this seems like a good shortcut. And then you go through and you drive down 5 kilometers only to find that the road marked on the map is actually blocked off by an illegal gate. That really, 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 really annoys me.
Yeah, that happens. I think my other petty complaint has to do with walking dogs off leash, which is very common. I'm sure if you live in a smaller town or something, it's not that big of a problem to have your dog follow up behind you. But there's busy roads, and again, when there's power outages, no streetlights. If you're a tiny little dog that has black fur, I can't see that thing, so it's just running around, putting itself and others in danger. And very frequently on the neighborhood page, there's announcements of this dog got out and is running around. And someone will say, oh, they were going for a walk and there's a loud sound and they just ran off. Walk your dog on a leash, please. And sometimes they'll say oh, this dog is self-walking. So I guess some people will just let the dog out to like it's a cat or something. And I don't like that.
Ukrainians are very permissive with their animals sometimes, but they're very much seen as outside kind of animals. There's tons of rules of what you can do inside with an animal, but outside they can do whatever they want. I think I legitimately find it more shocking to see a dog on a leash than off. I can hardly picture someone walking a dog on a leash in Ukraine.
Next one, related to the above, do you get a big culture shock when you moved there? What are some things that really stood out at the time, but you've now grown used to? Well, here's the thing with culture shock. It's not the big things that throw you off. You get into certain rhythms, certain unspoken rules of behavior that no one really thinks about or vocalizes much. But when those things change, those are the things that really throw you off. And for me, that was personal space. I come from the Midwest, so Romeo, who's more grown up in New York, would probably differ greatly on this. But in the Midwest, we give each other a lot of space. People standing next to you can be very uncomfortable. We just don't do that. Kiev, exact opposite. People feel no weirdness at all about standing directly over your shoulder. They feel no discomfort of just kind of bumping into you a bit even. You can just, walking down the street, you might bump shoulders with somebody, and it means absolutely nothing. Whereas in some parts of America, that is taken as basically starting a fight. So that one to me is the biggest. And going back to America, actually, when I notice the opposite of when I'm at the store or something and somebody goes, "Oh, I'll get out of your way," and they're like 2-3 feet away from me, I'm like, you don't have to do that. We aren't sharing the same space right now. And that's the big one to me as far as culture shocks go.
Honestly, it was the same thing even for me. Just Ukrainians are used to less personal space than Americans are. When I first started dating my wife, she would notice that if I was going to talk to someone on the street, I stand like significantly away from them and then just kind of yell my question. And she's like, "What are you doing? That's super rude." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? I don't want to harass the person. I just want to like ask the time or the weather or whatever." She's like, "You should go up to them and ask them like a normal person." I'm like, "I am. That's what a normal thing is." She's like, "No, you're standing like a meter away yelling at them." Like that's how you talk to strangers. So it's definitely a thing that Ukrainians are just used to less personal space than Americans are in general.
How is the pizza in Ukraine? They don't do anything weird with it, like put pineapple on it, do they? They do other weird. They like to put corn on it.
They also like to put French fries on it. And if you get the pizza from like a supermarket or something, they don't use tomato sauce and mozzarella. They'll use ketchup and Ukrainian cheese, which does not melt properly.
Yeah, there's definitely different categories of pizza. There's like the really cheap kind, which is my opinion on pizza is that it is the hardest thing to mess up in the world. There is good pizza, and then it's hard to do a truly bad pizza. There is, yes, that is food pizza. So even the really cheap kind, it can be strange, but like, yes, this is bread with cheese on it. All right, I can deal with that. However, there are some really, really good pizza here. One of my
There's even good cheap pizza here. One of my favorites is this place called Pizza Day, which makes just your normal greasy ass pizza. Their pepperoni is actually pepperoni and not a Ukrainian salami analog, which is very nice. And it's covered in Italian herbs. And there's good high end pizza as well. Il Molino, which is a pizza chain, has stone fired ovens. It's pretty pricey compared to other pizzas, but it's pretty good quality. The majority of it, to be honest, is not that good. Like if you just open a food delivery app, we have Glovo and we have Bolt Food. Most of the pizza places there, their options aren't very good. Domino's is garbage as usual. But there is good pizza and there is some great pizza and there's a lot of very mediocre.
I really like the pizza at Food Spot. Food Spot, it's like 4 restaurants crammed into one location, basically. And they sell their own merch. It's a bit on the pricier side, but the pizza at Food Spot, they have sourdough pizza. I really like the sourdough. So that's one of the better middle higher end pizzas. I think it's definitely there. Like if you look for it, there is some really fantastic pizza. But the interesting thing is that for whatever reason in the 90s, when they decided to introduce like restaurants, like not like the Soviet Union banquet halls or whatever, but restaurants, for whatever reason, the thing that really proliferated was the pizza and sushi restaurant. They are less and less, I don't know, cool now, but there's still a lot of them. And if you go to even like relatively small cities, you get the pizza and sushi restaurant. The pizza and sushi are serviceable, let's say. I don't know. Is there a reason for this? Like when you were coming to Ukraine in the summers, was that a thing that you noticed, was the pizza and sushi?
Pizza, yes. Basically when in the like mid 90s, when pizza places started popping up, obviously they got super popular. And then the restaurants or not the restaurants, rather, the supermarkets also started making their pizzas, which further made pizza popular. And sushi was always seen as this, like, the very fancy, like, rich people kind of food. So if you wanted to, like, spend some money and show your friends that you have money, you could go to a sushi place and order a bunch of sushi. I think, honestly, that's mostly it. Just sushi is really popular here. And so is pizza. So most restaurants don't really bother thinking of anything. They'll just serve the same sushi and pizza of average to bad quality and be happy, I guess.
Hey, this next one is what the fans really demanded. So feel free to let slip the dogs of war on this. I know Romeo has some spicy food takes.
So just to preface this, I'm not a big fan of Ukrainian cuisine, but specifically the cooked stuff. I think that anything pickled or cured or smoked in Ukraine is amazing, from the fish to the meat to the veggies. The grilling is amazing. What I really don't like, though, is anything that has to do with cabbage or beets or boiled meat. These are three pretty fundamental aspects of Ukrainian cooking: boiled cabbage, boiled beets, and boiled meat. I find it utterly disgusting. The Ukrainian adaptations of, like, noodle dishes, something they call funchoza, which was actually developed in the Soviet Union by the Korean Soviet community, the Koryo community. They were trying to make some Korean dishes using Soviet ingredients. Funchoza was one of them, which is just like this. It uses something called funchoza noodles, which are very thin, loopy noodles, kind of like rice noodles, but the texture is not great. And then they just mix it with not really any spices, just like some carrots and some boiled chicken fillet, and you put it all together, and it's technically like a noodle salad type thing. I just hate it. Ukrainians don't really like flavor that much. They don't really like spices that much. And as a result, a lot of Ukrainian food is just sort of bland. It's home cooking. A lot of people are like, oh, that just sounds like what my grandmother used to cook. Yeah, that's what I don't like it. I don't want to eat the food my grandmother used to cook. Like, I want to eat good food that tastes good and was prepared professionally, or at least developed professionally, where by a person who knows how cooking works, and not just let me just boil a bunch of shit and throw it into a pot and then serve it. Like, and that describes so much of Ukrainian cuisine. I'm just not a fan. But again, anything cured, salted, smoked, pickled, all of that is just absolutely amazing. The dairy products, amazing. It's just the actual active cooking that Ukrainians are just not good at.
There's different types of Ukrainian cooking, I'll put it. And what Romeo is talking about here is your standard home cooking that your Soviet grandma will put together. And yes, that is often lacking in strong flavor. Like, a lot of Ukrainians will be eating a lot of grechka, buckwheat, a lot of boiled meat, like he said, kotlety, chicken burger kind, I don't know, like meat patties. And those often are, I don't know, I'm someone who likes strong flavors and they just don't have them. I don't know. But then there's, cookbook Ukrainian food. And that is the stuff that is supposed to represent the culture as a whole, that a lot of people won't really follow there's a bit more bolder in its use of especially herbs. Ukrainian cooking, if you kind of have an idealized version of it, I'd say involves a lot more herbs, less so spices, but fresh greens and things that are pretty tasty. If you go to the grilled shashlik restaurants, that's always great. There are some very excellent restaurants that are doing like a modern take on Ukrainian cuisine that is usually very innovative, but uses Ukrainian traditional like techniques and ingredients, a lot of berries and currant and all that kind of stuff that elevates what is often pretty basic type food. Let's be honest here, a lot of poverty food from the Soviet Union into something that's a bit bolder and experimental and all that. So there's different takes on that. But I think the important thing here is that Ukraine has extremely, extremely good produce. The actual ingredients that you buy here will be better than the ingredients you buy in the United States. So whatever you choose to do with that from there will be better than what the same dish that is made here will often be better than the same dish that's made in America, just because the vegetables are better. Last one out, best type of kvass to sip while shitposting.
I dislike kvass because it tastes like liquid bread, and if I want bread, I can eat.
I like kvass. I don't like most store-bought kvass. For whatever reason, it just tastes better when it's made by some random person on the street who fills it in a empty plastic bottle for you. That is the best type of kvass. So with that, we'll round off our Q&As. Got a lot of good questions for you. We might have another one of these in the future. Every few months we'll do this. So send them in. Sign up to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype to join our Discord and send in these questions. But for the future, if you would like to support Ukraine more broadly, you can go to our link tree and see our list of resources and potential charities to give to. If you would like to join our community and support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. Thank you all to our wonderful supporters who gave us these questions and everything else that you do for us. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kukratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike Perrone, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Etienne Soleil, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Marguerite, Michael Wickman, PLM, Shieldwall, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Aidan McDonald, Alex Grochmal, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Demetrio, Emily Bavona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Add to Laugh, Jacob Hoem, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Laura De Leon, Laurie Halila, Lemonkin, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noam Hart, Paul Bailey, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Berry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tokayuk, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Veronica, Victoria Leontoneva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much for your support. Till next time, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!